champions. I'm Amy Morgan, the feature writer with the Marriage Initiative. I am so pleased today to introduce you to Dr. Randy Carlson. Dr. Randy is the chairman of Family Life Communications and founder of Intentional Living. He's a licensed marriage and family counselor, best-selling author, and nationally syndicated radio host with 28 years of experience counseling and hosting marriage and family events. You can hear his 1-minute intentional living radio programs on more than 40 stations nationwide and streaming on his website. Dr. Randy has written or co-authored 7 books, including The Power of One Thing and his most recent, Hijacked Emotions. He has appeared on national radio and television talk shows such as Good Morning America, Focus on the Family with Dr. James Dobson, and Moody's Midday Connection. Dr. Randy, thank you so much for being here.
You're welcome, Amy. Nice to be with you.
Oh, we're just so glad to have you. You started in radio. And so let's talk about that. How does a licensed marriage and family counselor get from radio to where you are today?
Yeah, I started in radio when I was a teenager, volunteering at a local Christian radio station, which was Family Life Radio when it started with one simple little radio station. And it kind of got the bug to be in radio, enjoyed communicating, talking to people, enjoying my time. And so as I graduated from high school, I went on and got my training in broadcasting and joined Family Life Radio as one of the first 3 employees. Later became president and now chairman of the board and sort of semi-retired, but we have over 40 radio stations around the country, plus the intentional living broadcast that we syndicate on actually over 100 other radio stations every day. So about 150 radio stations plus online streaming, our podcast. But when I was about 30 years old, Amy, God really impressed on me that I wanted to make sure that my part of doing radio had an impact. And so prayed about it, talked to my wife, and went back to school when I was 33, which is a whole nother topic, and finished my undergraduate degree, went on and get my master's in counseling, then went on and did my doctorate in psychology, counseling psychology, and started our intentional living ministry. Within our ministry, at one point we had a counseling centers with about 5,000 clients a year we were working with around the country. And so it's been just a busy time, a great time. I just feel that ministry gives us an opportunity to impact people for Christ, and radio is a medium that's still very relevant, impacting people, plus all the new digital world with what we're doing with podcasts and all the other things that we're creating digitally. We have a worldwide outreach with a singular message, which is intentional living. We just believe that God is intentional. We see that in the book of Genesis. In the beginning, God created. It wasn't a random thing. It wasn't an accident. God didn't say, oops, I created all this stuff. He did it intentionally. And then it goes on to say, let's create man in our own image. And so I believe that we as human beings and as followers of Christ, we've been created to be intentional as well. We can talk a little bit about what that is as we go on. But so God really laid on my heart to start a ministry within a ministry called Intentional Living, which is our radio broadcast and our conferences and books and things that you mentioned that allow us to help people live intentionally in their marriage, which is one of our 5 essential areas: marriage, finances, health, work, and of course their faith. And so that's kind of my journey to where I am at this point, and seeing the next generation picking this up and seeing people around the world taking this message beyond what I started is pretty exciting.
Well, I do want to talk about your message, but I do want to just go back and talk just a little bit, because so many people do find you through your radio programs and your radio show. Mm-hmm. So I would like to talk about the Family Life Communications and what, if they're going to try to turn in, probably the easiest way would be to go online and find you streaming and then maybe find it in your car or somewhere. But what would they hear?
Well, if they come to the radio station, which is MyFLR for Family Life Radio, myflr.org, they're going to hear adult contemporary Christian music with some great staff 24 hours a day. And what we've done, we've designed that throughout the day, in between the songs, we just have stories of people living intentionally in Christ and what difference that's making in their life. A lot of really positive stories and impact of what Christ is doing. We just don't want to be a place that we hear music. without having some content too. So we have that throughout the day. And then I have my opportunity to spend about a half hour in the morning, half hour at night, just talking to people on topics that they relate to. Today, for instance, we talked about blended families for a half hour. And I just asked the question, hey, if you're in a blended family, you know it's difficult. What is one intentional thing you have to do to be successful in a blended family? Tomorrow, we're going to talk about opposite sex friendships outside of marriage. Huge topic. I write about it in one of my books. And so we're going to open up the phone line tomorrow and ask the question, what's one thing you're doing intentionally in your marriage to guard yourself to have healthy opposite sex friendships? So we try to be very practical, very biblical, we're relevant to where people are today, but also very intentional, not just talking about it, but what one thing are you going to do to protect your marriage, for instance, when it comes to opposite sex friendships? So whatever the topic is, we come back to how do you live that intentionally for God's glory and your benefit. And I don't think those are mutually exclusive. I think when you give glory to God, we benefit from it, and personally and in our marriages. And so that's why we do what we do, and that's how the radio fits with our intentional living message.
Well, I love that you, and as we talk, let's unpack exactly what intentionally is, because it's
Mhm.
the theme of your whole ministry. But when you say a word over and over, sometimes it's like, wait, what does that really
Yeah.
mean in your definition?
Well, let me give you a word picture. Intentional living is our ministry. And I see it as kind of like two bookends. On one bookend is intentional. If we want to be successful, we're talking marriage. I know that's a big topic. If you want to be successful, for instance, in your marriage, you better be intentional, which means you better have some goals, some priorities. You better be clear on what's important to you and a direction that you're headed, a target that you're aiming for, a dream. These things are important. That's intentional. The living part is on the other end, the other bookend. The living part is the daily action. What am I going to do to fulfill that dream? And there's really three kinds of people, Amy, that we see in my work. There are people who are very intentional. They know what they want. They know what their dreams are. To get up in the morning, stand in the showers, to be intentional, have a dream, have a goal for the day, right? But they don't take daily action. They don't act on it. They have dreams and goals. They're intentional, but they're not living it. And these folks are in the box of what we call good intentions, which is really the box of procrastination. Procrastination is filled with regret, disappointment, I should have kind of feeling. And
Mm.
in the other box are people who are living, they're busy, they get up every day and they have a list of things that they're doing, but they're not very intentional about it. In other words, it's not really aiming toward a goal or a direction. And these people are in the box of what I call an unintentional life.
Mm.
An unintentional life is a life filled with a lot of weariness. And I
Mm.
ask people, if you're feeling weary, overwhelmed, at the end of the day, you fall into bed and you look around and say, why am I doing this? What's the purpose behind this? Your busyness is really leading to an unintentional life. So intentional living, or in this case, living intentionally, that's the third box. An intentional life is a life filled with intention, the right goals, direction, and so on. And then one thing every day. We talk about the power of one thing. In fact, I wear a little wristband. Maybe you can see it here. Every
Yes.
day, one thing. And I remind myself, what one thing am I going to do today that when I go to bed tonight, I can look back on and say, that was a very positive part of my intention for life.
Mm.
I'm going to do a lot of other things. We're going to have fun, do a lot of other things too. But I think every day needs to be filled with at least one thing that's moving us in that direction. And I think of the Apostle Paul in Philippians, where he says, forgetting those things which are behind, I press toward the goal. And that's an example of an intentional life. He didn't get trapped by the past, good or bad, but he kept his eye on the direction he was headed, his vision for the future, and then he acted on it every day. And that's really kind of the basics of what intentional living is about. So in our classes and our marriage conferences, we really bring that down to the basics of how do you have an intentional marriage? What do you do in your marriage to ward off just living, being roommates, or feeling like you're prison mates, or get to the place where you're soulmates. Or on the other hand, being intentional but not following through. How do we bring those two together is really what we focus on in our mission and our ministry and our teaching.
Well, and you mentioned you have events, you have marriage conferences and teaching and things you can sign up for on your website, correct?
Yes. Yeah, we do. In fact, if you come to our website, Amy, there's a lot of help there. We have a lot of things we just make available. We have our list of our intentionals, the top 10 list on different topics of marriage and family and life. You have archives of all of our intentional living broadcasts for way back, so you can kind of pick the topics you're interested in. We have articles and many other things that they'll find helpful just at theintentionallife.com. That's our web address, theintentionallife.com. So our ministry, we have two things: the radio, which is my FLR, 24 hours a day, and then intentional living, which is a part of it, which is theintentionallife.com. And you can find either one by going to one of those websites.
Oh, that is so great. So let's talk too about your book. The Power of One Thing, because again, you
Mhm.
said as people are procrastinating or feel weary, maybe they're overwhelmed. They know something needs to change.
Yeah.
Something is not right, but like what, how? You have an idea, some help for people how they can get started, correct?
Well, I do. And I think, we tend to focus our ministry often on the areas we struggle with ourselves. I've discovered that. And I have to admit, one of the things I've struggled with is either procrastinating or getting overwhelmed. And so I can take on projects and then I feel overwhelmed, or I have good ideas and then kicking into gear and doing it can be difficult. And we can beat ourselves up with a lot of the shoulds and oughts of life. That's one of the reasons I wrote the book of The Power of One Thing. I was saying to myself, I think, and to the readers, in our lives, there are things that are going to be really important. And the first thought is, I have all of these issues. If we're talking about marriage, you might thinking, oh man, we're not communicating. The kids have got a problem. We got financial issues. We got issues with the in-laws. We're struggling. We're not connecting with each other. Our sex life isn't good. People can start to feel overwhelmed, and that's how they often connect with another person of the opposite sex. They find someone to connect with who hears them, listens to them, and connects with them. And so I wrote this book to say, look, if you want to break inertia, and there's two kinds of inertia. The one inertia is that you're stuck and you're not moving.
Yeah.
The other inertia is you're moving, but you're moving in the wrong direction.
Ooh.
And so inertia is the tendency to stay going in the same direction at the same speed, unless there's some force put on it. And so if you're a train stopped on a railroad track, that's inertia. But if you're going 60 miles an hour down the track, that's also inertia.
Interesting.
And so the idea is, if you're not happy with the direction you're going, or you're not happy that you're not going anywhere, please just do the next right one thing. What is it today that we could do? And this is the question I ask people in my conferences. After we have a lot of fun. I give a lot of stories, talk about my wife, Donna, and I over, 50 years of marriage. We married at teenagers. I tell people that I was a head person. I'm kind of thick-headed, and my wife is more of a heart-hand person. And our first date, for instance, I think I shared with you that when she said her hands were cold at the football game because it was a November night in Michigan.
Oh yeah.
Instead of holding her hands close to my heart and saying, well, let me warm them for you, I said, why don't you sit on them? Hello. But sometimes in our marriages, what happens is we get this sense of inertia. And so if we can just do one thing, and at my conferences, I ask people this question at the end: what one thing could you do in the next 30 days, every day, that would make the single biggest difference in your marriage? And people will raise their hand and say, stop criticizing my wife for the next 30 days, or help without being asked, or spending time with the kids instead of assuming my wife's going to be the one taking care of the kids. And what happens is, when they identify one thing, they go out the door with the one thing wristband. And I hear back later that just that act of saying, here's one thing, I'm overwhelmed, but if I did this one thing, it'll make a difference. I get calls and emails back later that people say that made a huge difference. Because if I could do one thing, then I can do another thing. And pretty soon they start to build new inertia in a healthy direction and a healthy speed. And so that's really what the power of one thing is. It's a simple message. Do the next right one thing, give God the glory, and you'll benefit from it.
Well, and it applies to marriage, but it also applies in other areas, right?
Oh,
Because
yeah.
you said you have, life finances, different things.
Yep. Yeah, we teach like on finances. I got a really simple message. Hey, listen, you're 25 years old. You're getting started in life. Maybe you're married. Maybe you're 30 years old. How about you do this 10, 10, 80? Tithing, 10%. Saving, investing 10%, and learning to live on 80%. If you did that over an extended period of time, you'll be very wealthy by the time you're 65 or 70 years old. And if you're older, start with a higher amount. Maybe it's going to be 10, and 20 and 30, or whatever it's going to be. I mean, a 70, whatever it is, but being intentional. So we teach people, when you put a plan together, break it down into one thing that you can manage. Because otherwise, as I said, we tend to fall into one of those two boxes of either an unintentional life where we're weary and overwhelmed, or a good intentioned life where we feel discouraged and we procrastinate.
And you have a top 10 list for marriage, right? That kind of gives some people some ideas of where to get started.
Yeah, in fact, we have several top 10 lists on our website having to do with marriage, blended families, raising kids. And I think a couple of the most important items on our top 10 list in marriage is don't criticize is always important. Research is clear, Amy, that the thing that destroys marriage more than anything is criticism. And so when we learn to encourage our spouse every day, speaking a word of encouragement into our marriage. I don't know how you do that. For some, it's physical touch. Sometimes, like my friend Gary Chapman talks about, maybe it's a gift, but often it's a word. Just to say, I'm really proud of you and I love you, or thank you. And so building a strong marriage comes down to the words that we speak. The Bible says, don't go to bed at night with wrath or anger. And we've tried to practice that for 50 years in our marriage, my wife and I. If we have a disagreement, not to go to bed without resolving it, or at least discussing it, or agreeing to disagree on it. But what happens is, I think with problems, it's like Velcro. It starts to stick to you over time, and in the process, it drags down a marriage. So dealing with those things, ripping them off, dealing with them is a healthy thing to do.
Yeah. No, I like that. I like that. And the criticism, and when you're talking about encouragement, I think you gave me my one thing that I need to be intentional to think about that, to think about how something I can do to encourage my husband every day. That's a really good reminder.
Yeah, I think what happens many times, Amy, is we think we're being helpful. I was talking about being a head person, and I'm a problem solver. Okay, that's what I do. I do that on the radio. I do it in counseling. I do it with people. And then if I bring that problem solving at home, bringing it home, my wife isn't looking for me to be her problem solver. And I tell the story. I was sitting on the lazy boy chair out here one night and watching her in the kitchen empty the dishwasher. And I'm an analytical person trying to make things better, more efficient. And I was noticing that she was putting the plates on one side and the dishes over here and the cups over there. And I thought to myself, Donna, there's a better way there's a better way you could do that.
She does not want your better way in her dishes.
Thank you. That's exactly true. But I think sometimes that's why I tell people we always judge ourselves by our good intentions. I think one of the major reasons we have problems in relationships is because I think, generally speaking, not always, but generally, we have good intentions toward another person. We either want to help them, or we want to give them some counsel, or we think we're being encouraging to them by instructing or correcting or whatever. But other people never judge us by our good intentions. Other people always judge us by their expectations. And so if my intention is good and their expectation is something different, there's where conflict can occur. I can say something to my wife and she misunderstands it and she's upset. And I'm thinking, why are you upset? I mean, I was trying to be helpful, or vice versa. Well, her expectation wasn't that I would give her advice on how to load the dishwasher.
The
Her
dishwasher.
expectation was to get your bottom out here and you do it. If you got a better, you come out and do it, And I think sometimes in our relationships, if we just stopped and got behind the eyes of the other person, our kids or our spouse or coworkers, and kind of see life like they see life, it can make a big difference in our marriage and our family.
Well, that I really like that analogy when you talk about getting behind the eyes. You have a book that you wrote too that also pertains to marriage, Starved for Affection.
Mm-hmm.
And that was
Yeah.
something that you mentioned, kind of how people were missing each other in different areas.
Yeah. Well, we started to hear a lot of stories from people, and basically they were saying, boy, we just don't feel affection in our marriage. They may not have used that term, but that's really what it was. And we know that the research shows that's a huge need, especially for a woman.
Mm.
And of course, we've had books written on love and respect and other topics, but affection is really the idea of we're affecting our spouse, and we always affect each other. The question is, how are we doing that? And we want to affect our spouse in a way that really draws them closer to us. And so I spent a lot of time writing this book, Starved for Affection, to help people see there are things that you can do to build affection, communicate, find out again behind the eyes of your spouse what affects them in the most positive way. Because here's a fact: my wife it will be positively affected in a different way, perhaps, than you are, Amy, from your husband. And so I think, like I mentioned, our friend Gary Chapman, he wrote this best-selling book on the love languages. And he talks about that, I think, in a sense. He's really saying that words affect some people, gifts, time, service. These are different ways that we can speak to each other. And so the whole idea of the Star for Affection was to describe why it's important and how you can start affecting your spouse in a more intentional, healthy, positive, powerful way in your marriage.
And you had some places where people were really feeling bereft, right? You identified some pockets of places that people might not even realize. Weren't
Mhm.
there certain areas?
Yeah, in their marriages.
Mhm.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think sometimes what'll happen in a marriage, I mentioned briefly a little bit ago about head, heart, and hand, that if I see the world through my heart, I mean, I'm a heart person. You can be missing the heart of your spouse. You can be speaking to their head, or you can be busy doing things with your hands, but if you're missing their heart, that can create a distance, a sense, a gap of a lack of connection in the relationship. And so with blended families, I just did that show today on blended families. And, what I heard from people all over the country when they called was, boy, we've got to communicate. We got off base. We weren't on the same page with the kids, or we had an ex-spouse. And you got one spouse that's further along, think they have it all together, and the other one's struggling, and they're not connecting and not communicating. So just being mindful enough to stop and be present with your spouse, and connecting with what's going on right now is a powerful thing. And we spent a lot of time writing about that in terms of what do you do with all different topics. Like I mentioned, opposite sex friendships. I have a whole topic there. There's an example where we heard stories when we wrote that chapter from people who are saying, look, I have a friend from high school. We've been opposite sex. We've been friends for a long time. My spouse is not comfortable with it. And I don't care if she's not comfortable with it. I'm going to continue that relationship. And I say, you're a stupid man. You're a stupid man. Now, it may be that there's everything healthy in that relationship. There may be nothing wrong with it. But I'll tell you what, if your wife is struggling with that, you better be aware of the fact that's impacting the intimacy of your relationship. And so there can be these things that develop, misunderstandings and lack of communication around things that seem pretty simple, but at the end of the day, they create real problems in the marriage.
Yeah. Well, and then as you were bringing up that scenario, I was thinking that could get certainly very emotional, and that's the title of your newest book, Hijacked Emotions.
Yes.
Let's talk about that one.
Yeah, in fact, that book came out right at the beginning of the pandemic, and I little did I realize that we would have a whole nation with hijacked emotions.
Yeah,
Worry, anger. I mean, look at where we are today, Amy.
yeah,
I mean, we just, through the political season and everything going on, and the stress and relationships, and emotions can get easily hijacked.
yeah.
And when they do, boy, if we run with a hijacked emotion, it can be damaging. There are people in prison today. In fact, I would dare say many of, if not most of the people in prison today, if they were being honest, would say, I'm here because of a hijacked emotion.
Hmm.
My emotions ran away with me and caused me to do something that I regret.
Yeah.
Hijacked emotions can make poor decisions in marriage, in finance, in health. Hijacked emotions take over and we overeat. Hijacked emotions take over and we say something we regret. Hijacked emotions overtake us and we spend things we didn't intend to spend on.
Yeah.
And so the whole book is designed to help us see that a hijacked emotion needs to be brought under control. And when I think of the Apostle Paul, he says, taking captive every thought, out of obedience to Christ. And so a lot of it has to do with our thinking. If we can take control of our thoughts, that's the sort of the center of gravity when it comes to our emotions.
What is a hijacked emotion? I mean, you gave some examples of, but if you were going to define it, what exactly? How would someone know if their emotion has
Mhm.
been hijacked?
There are positive emotions in life and there's negative emotions. And either one can actually be hijacked.
Mhm.
When we think of anger, resentment, guilt, these are negative emotions. And when they overtake our lives, they can be destructive. We know that, we can see it. And so that's a hijacked emotion. But you can also have emotions that you care, you love, desire, things that could be very positive, but they can also get hijacked. Desire can overtake your life in a negative way. Caring for people, if it's not managed correctly and your emotions overtake you, can end up doing things that you later say, I regret that. And so I say a hijacked emotion is any emotion that overtakes our life and causes us to think, feel, or behave in ways that are not honoring to God
Mhm.
and helping me move toward the goals and the intentions of my life would be a hijacked emotion.
And how do you prevent yourself from doing that? What do you say? Do you wrap it in with the one thing that you start with that next right step to do something differently?
I think there's a couple of things. Obviously, we always come back to the one thing. When I'd ask the question, what one thing could you do that would help you deal with your anger? Or what's the one thing you could do that might be causing you to feel lonely and loneliness? What one thing can you do? Well, and then we talk about getting out, serving others, and so we give practical one things that you could do to try to break that pattern when it comes to our emotions, because they can be very damaging. But yeah, one thing is a powerful thing, and ultimately we come back to that. We try to understand the reason, what's causing this, what's behind it. But if we can stop and ask ourselves again the question, is the emotion I'm experiencing right now going to move me in the right direction? Because Amy, here's a fact. Emotions, I believe God has given us emotions as a fuel.
Mm.
It's like a fuel in our car that moves the car. And
Mm.
so when we see in the book of Ephesians to be angry, but do not sin, we see that in Philippians, or Ephesians rather. And Paul is really saying there's nothing wrong with anger. It's a fuel. The question is, what do you do with it? And so if you're feeling angry, we want you to think about what's causing the anger, what's behind this, and then make the right decision. Don't sin. Don't go in a direction that you're going to later regret. And so emotions are good. And I think sometimes, to be real honest, I think sometimes as Christian parents and grandparents, we discourage our kids from expressing their emotions. We need to help them see that their emotions are okay, but we want to help them manage those emotions so it doesn't become sin or destructive in their life.
Yeah. Well, that is just so wonderful food for thought and a lot of great learning and just some really great inspirational uh, thoughts here. So, Dr. Randy, it was so great talking to you. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Amy, and God bless you for what you're doing with your marriage work and what you're doing to help couples. And may God's blessing be on you and your whole team.
Well, we are just so grateful. And as always, marriage champions, you can find out more about Dr. Randy and intentional living at marriageinitiative.org.